Hello and welcome to the Rask Network. What you're about to hear and see is limited to general financial information only. Please be sure to speak to your financial planner or refer to our financial services guide available at rask.com.au/FSG before acting on the information.
G'day, welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. I'm Pete Wargent from Alan Wargent Property Buyers, and as we head towards Christmas, I'm here nearly for the last time this year, but not quite, with Chris Bates from the Flint Group. G'day, Chris. How's things?
Doing well. I mean, I can taste Christmas. It's around the corner, right? But just getting really excited. We're actually leaving next Friday, so whatever that date is, the 13th, I think it is, and heading down the coast, down to Melbourne and stopping down at a few places in Jervis Bay and Malakuta. So, getting very excited. I'm not sure about you, Pete, but another big year has finally completed.
It has been a busy time for especially Southeast Queensland. We actually had our Christmas party this week and managed to squeeze in some golf at Bribie Island and another round with the guys at Noosa as well. So a bit of planning for 2025, but mostly just whining and dining, really, and a bit of golf. And I saw in the news this week, Chris, you're not going to mention this, but I can. I was just looking in the advisor.com.au, top mortgage brokers of 2024 and elite broker rankings. It seems to me the number one is Chris Bates of the Flint Group of all of the advisors nationally. So that's the elite broker ranking. So that's an amazing result. Congratulations.
Stitch me up here, Pete, but thank you. It's a real team effort, right? I think broking's not an individual sport, particularly once you start writing some big numbers, like we're writing as a team. And while it's an individual award, but it's pretty hats off to the team, to be honest, because we've had a big year, and we did up coming number one, which was great. But I love the team awards, to be honest, because my name's there, but behind us we've got a whole strategy team, our client experience team, our team in Nepal. It's it's not all up to me. So thanks for mentioning that, Pete. What else has been keeping yourself busy? How's you coming into Christmas with buying?
We've got a couple of for a few open engagements that we're trying to lock away. Maybe there's not much in the way of new listings coming onto the market at the moment. So we're trying to look at off-market deals where we can. Missed out on one on the weekend, unfortunately. Just at Sunrise Beach in Sunshine Coast, but that's the way it goes sometimes. Yeah, it's a funny time of year because some vendors are looking to maybe just drop the price to get a deal done so they can move on and think about Christmas and New Year. And some buyers are just thinking, maybe I'll just sneak something before Christmas. But the number of new listings coming on every day and every week is obviously lower. So it's a funny time, especially in Queensland, where a lot of people go away for their Christmas break over December and January. But we'll still be active over the summer break, and just keeping everyone busy right up to the end of December, I think.
Yeah, so I think the federal election, right, is every week we're getting a week closer to that. Pete, when your experience over a long time in the property market, what do you feel like happens in the lead up to the election in terms of listings? And do a lot of people just always want to sit on the sideline, or do you find a lot of people want to make bets prior to an election and hopefully get the upside? What's your take on things?
I think so. Look, that can definitely be a factor in making people more indecisive. I think it depends a little bit on what policies are being taken to the election. So I think 2019 was probably one of the big ones, because there were two very different ideas being taken to the electorate, and potentially very different outcomes with the housing market, particularly for investors. So I think there was a big pause there, which immediately snapped back post-election. I'm not so sure this time that the policies being taken to the election will be all that different. I think the coalition's got some ideas around using superannuation for housing, which would obviously be a demand side sort of push for the market. Labour Party's passed its Help to Buy scheme legislation this week, which we'll talk about during the show. But probably I wouldn't be surprised if both parties talk about trimming immigration and maybe a few tweaks here and there, but it's not like we're talking about fundamentally different ideologies. So maybe not quite the same impact this time around.
Yeah, I think it's as all the news cycle ramps up in early next year, I do think any type of indecisiveness really affects supply and listings coming on the market. And With it being in May next year, I think a lot of sellers will be like, wow. And inflation's up probably, unless confidence really shifts over the next few months and rate expectations really start to dive and there's going to be rate cuts imminently, you could find that, uncertainty around rate cuts, uncertainty around the election really means that the autumn listing periods is really dire. And that's really what has been supporting prices. It hasn't been the buyers are super cashed up and a hell for leather. It's just because there's been very low listings on the market. And I don't believe the story that there's, ridiculously amount of listings on the market across the country. When you look at the stats, that's not true, particularly for quality properties. And so, yeah, I'm not as optimistic as probably I'd like to be for the autumn period and thinking that a lot of great properties are going to come on the market. I think it's going to be another tough 6 months till more certainty arrives.
Well, the auction market has finished, or at least it's slowed down and peaked relatively early this year. So we're only in the first week of December. CoreLogic has already said that the volumes for next week are already way off, and then once you go beyond next week, well, we're into the Christmas slowdown anyway. So I think there's a bit of a rush as people try to get stuff done in November, and some big auction volumes, particularly Melbourne and Sydney. But yeah, it seems that that's dying off now as we sort of dribble into the Christmas period. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see how things open out in 2025, but at the moment, listing numbers are quite low. I just saw this week some building approvals figures were out and 22-month high. So we're still not talking big numbers, maybe 15,000 or so over the month and 163,000 over the year. So we're still way down really on where things need to be, which probably needs to be, let's say, 20,000 a month and 240,000 over the year. But probably we're probably through the lows now. I think developers are probably looking ahead to a supply shortage and thinking that they can sort of sell into that market next year. So a bit of a rebound for unit approvals, especially in Melbourne, nearly 3,000, and also in Sydney, a couple of thousand there. So maybe I think things are just starting to come back into balance a little bit. What do you reckon?
Oh, I think it's, particularly that Victorian no stamp duty was a really good call down there. Particularly they were targeting the downsizer market, which I mentioned on previous episodes. And I reckon that could start to go around the country. So well played to the Victorian government. It's been hard to say that they've been doing many things great for the property market down there over the last few years, but I think that's been a good call. I don't think it's great for first-time buyers and investors, but I do think it's great to getting more downsizers out of houses and starting to free up all those transactions along the journey. And so, one of the election things next year is obviously going to be immigration. What's your thoughts on that, Pete? And there's a few stories going around the traps this week.
Yeah, probably we'll do that probably as our first of our three news stories of the week. So just before we come on to that, CoreLogic had its monthly house price update out, which was the 22nd month of growth, but it was actually pretty, I want to say growth, 0.1%. So it was pretty lackluster, I think, as we come in towards the end of the year. The thing that stood out to me there, a little section that Tim Law listed, rental price boom is over. Rents have been increasing for a few years now, but only 0.2% in the month and 5.3% over the year. So that's the lowest since early 2021. And I think, I guess there's a few things that are now just helping to push along that disinflation story. Lower rental price growth is definitely a good thing. And also just noticing around Brisbane over the last week or two, fuel prices have come down, which is a pleasant surprise because we've had $2 a litre and we've had some, especially on the highway, we've seen some horrendous prices over the past year or two, but now down into the 150s this week. So I think this is generally good news for the Reserve Bank. And in New Zealand, another 50 basis points cut this week and more to come next month. So I think, just before we come on to those immigration figures, I think just generally, it seems like a lot of things that got out of whack are now coming back into balance a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. I think, let's see how the election plays out next year. And I do think there's a lot of boom and bust sort of commentary going around now, just sort of reading the AFR this morning as well. And there's a lot of people jumping on the bandwagon saying the market runs over, CoreLogic, seen some big buyers agents coming out and saying, 15% house prices falls in Sydney, etc. I don't know. What's your take on this, Pete? It's always a time of year where people start to become forecasters for the next year. And what gets news is usually big swings either way. What's your take on some of the bearish views coming into 2025?
I don't know. If I was to look at all the fundamentals, obviously a lot can change, but we've still got high population growth. Market pricing is for interest rates to probably fall around about May, but it could happen earlier. It depends on the inflation figures. We've only had the first month of this quarter so far, but it already looks like we're getting a fairly soft core inflation figure for Q4. So I don't know, if you put that together, you'd probably say modest house price growth in 2025. I think Brisbane and Perth and Adelaide have still got some momentum going into 2025. Maybe Sydney and Melbourne not so much, but there's always lots of different scenarios, and we'll talk in a more detailed episode next week about our sort of predictions and outlook for 2025. But it feels to me like you've still got a shortage of housing, still got big population growth. Interest rates have been higher than they were, but on the way back down. And construction costs are still very, very high. So I guess if you put all that together, you would probably say, more modest growth, but probably growth.
Yeah, absolutely. Should we go into story number 1, Pete?
Yeah, so I guess as you already touched on, immigration, I think, will be a feature point or a flashpoint for the Australian election, whether it's April or May 2025. I think, this has already come home to roost in Canada, where Trudeau, the Prime Minister over there, is talking about pausing immigration. It's not exactly what he said. It's been a bit misreported, but I think, to some degree, that's kind of irrelevant because he's polling so badly now. He'll be voted out very shortly. Different in the UK, where there's a new government, Labour government, and the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, came out with some very strong words this week, saying that we've been running an open borders experiment and it hasn't worked and we need to cut immigration. Yeah. It's funny how the media narratives go, because if that came from a different party, you would say that's a hard line, that's a hard right line of talk. But obviously, the polling has been really bad for incumbent governments at the moment with the cost of living pressures, and they seem to be taking a hard line. And I was just thinking, this is bound to have some repercussions for Australia. No doubt the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, will be talking about cutting permanent migration to maybe 160,000 for Australia. Looking at the bookies, they actually have the coalition as favourites at the moment to win the federal election next year, $1.60 versus $2.20 for the Labour Party. So it's obviously a really difficult time for incumbent governments, given inflation and cost of living pressures. And I think I wouldn't be at all surprised if the Labour government comes out with something similar, because this is going to be a tight election. If I had to guess, I would probably say Labour would win, but maybe with a minority government. But I think whichever party gets in, I think there's going to be some moves to slow down the pace of immigration. Do you have any sort of thoughts on how they might go about doing it?
Oh, look, I think the immigration story was massive in COVID, right? A little bit of level one thinking was, COVID's coming. There's no one going to be moving here. The property market's going to crash. That it's so carefully balanced that as soon as you cut immigration, the market's going to go down. Because that's all where all the demand's coming from. But that's usually not what happens with migration, right? There's a lag effect that, people don't just move here and then all of a sudden buy a house the next day. Some people do, but often a lot of people are coming and doing, short-term visas, there's study visas, even if they are working visas and they've got decent incomes, it doesn't mean they buy. Often they rent first, they save up their deposit, and then they figure out where they want to buy and where they can afford. And sometimes it's, 1, 2, 3, and they might even have residency and it might be hard to get lending, etc. So, even if there is this cut to migration, I think the interlink to the property market is maybe in a few years' time, demand's a little bit lower, but and maybe it does also impact our rental markets in the short term, but that doesn't mean it affects prices. And so, I think this story is obviously happening for a reason, and I think it is happening because of our rental crisis in particular. I think if we didn't have a rental crisis, which the government basically caused anyway by really targeting investors since 2015 and making it less and less enticing to buy investments and hold investments, I think they would be. And also, I think they overcorrected, right? There was coming out of COVID, there was a appetite to sort of catch up from what Australia did lose over that period. And I think if you go back to the COVID days, we were saying, look, I think the government's absolutely going to try to push pedal to the metal when you come out of COVID to open the borders. And I think that's what they've done. And now they've realized maybe they've let in too many people. What's your thoughts, Pete?
Yeah, it's interesting to me how I guess they say we live in a global world now, or a global economy, but it's interesting just how similar a lot of these trends are in so many different countries. I think in the UK, the Office for National Statistics said that net migration for the last financial year was 700,000, and they revised up FY23 to 900,000. It was way higher than previously thought. And dwellings are being built. Well, there's 230,000 last year. So you can see if you get 1.6 million net migration in 2 years, there's no way you can build for that. And all of the same things being said, construction costs are too high, too much red tape, really hard to get planning approvals through. And there's been an anti-investor sort of sentiment, cutting back on tax benefits and everything else over a number of years. And now we're getting to the situation where it's become politically unpopular because you've got incumbent or sort of existing population really struggling to find somewhere to live or find a rental. New migrants are coming in, and it's creating a political flashpoint. And it's I guess Australia hasn't been quite so extreme maybe on some of those numbers, but it's the same problems, just playing out in a different environment. So yeah, I've completely forgotten your question now. I've rambled on too long, but it's obviously, I do think things like international student visas, I think that process will be trimmed back in 2025, and they'll be looking for ways just to cut back at the margin, and they may well as well as that probably look at reducing the permanent migration cap as well.
Yeah, let's go to story number 2, Pete, around this Help to Buy. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm a massive fan of these home equity schemes, but let's have a crack.
Yeah, so I think, the Labor government actually passed, no end of bills over the past week. I've lost count now, 30, 35 or something. Clearly, the idea is to clear the decks for calling an election fairly soon. One of the policies that got quite a bit of airtime and specifically relates to the housing market was the Help to Buy scheme. So 40,000 home buyers will be able to buy under the new legislation with as little as 2% deposit. That one always gets a lot of international sort of interest when people start hearing about low deposit lending into the housing market. This one is slightly different. I don't think it's a systemic issue because the numbers aren't big enough and it doesn't apply to everybody. So effectively, this will apply to single low-income earners, or if you can buy jointly with an income cap. There's price caps by state, but you don't have to be a first-home buyer. You can have owned property previously. So the way it generally works with these things is an equity contribution from the government of up to 40% of the cost of a new home or 30% of an existing home. And it's eligible for units, townhouses, houses, but there is just a cap depending on where in the country you're going to buy. So I think, it's the same old, isn't it? This doesn't do anything to improve the supply of housing. It does bring more buyers into the market, which is, I guess, governments like that because more stakeholders in the economy tends to be a good thing for a happy electorate. But I think there's always some downsides to these things. I mean, what happens if you end up buying a property and you lose money on the investment? Well, the taxpayer's effectively on the hook for that. And there's also the price caps, which don't always make it easy, especially in Sydney. So, yeah, I mean, do you think there'll be any impact on the market next year?
Look, I do think, there is a part of the market that isn't earning the income required to enter the market. And, I guess this is one of the next innovations by governments and banks to lend money to more people, right? And the real issue here is if people don't enter the market, let's say, and they're renting and they put some money into super, etc., and they end up not owning a property and they're always renting, then they get to retirement and they're still renting. That's where I would say one of the biggest portions of, rental stress is in the market, particularly for singles who haven't owned a home. And they get a bit more in the pension, but it's nowhere near enough to cover their rent. And, some significant financial strain there. And I think this together with maybe what the Liberal Party are doing as well with accessing super and things like that is if it's the way to enter the market, particularly if it can get you a good asset or a decent asset and something that you can live in long term versus renting, I think that's when you should consider it. I don't think it's let's just give it a go for a few years and see if we can get in bed with the government and just see if I can make some money. I think there's, and there are these caps in terms of incomes, they're not that high in terms of, and then what you can borrow based on a 4.5, 5 times multiple really limits the purchase prices and then the quality of assets. But, maybe regionally, you might have some options, maybe in different states around the country as well, not say Sydney and Melbourne. But yeah, I'm not a huge fan of these home equity schemes just because I do think that, you're going to wish that you owned it all, and it does put you in bed with the government and your limits in terms of your banks and things like that. But, if it's a decision between not buying now or never, it might be something you want to consider to give yourself some homes, some security long term. And so whether it has a huge impact on the market, I would say no. I think that the part of the market is absolutely on the lower end. And, a lot of these schemes don't get taken up by the amount that they're offering. So, they're offering 40,000. I'd be surprised if they're able to even get 40,000 people to sign up, but let's see how it goes, I guess.
It's 40,000 over 4 years as well, right? So we might get 10,000 people earning up to 90 grand in 2025. But as you said, there's no guarantee that those places get filled. And it's not something to do speculatively. You have to live in the house or the property that you buy. The government will effectively own 30 or 40% equity share. So it's not for everybody, but as I said, if it's a choice between that and being stuck in the long-term rental pool, if I was a single person earning under 90k, I'd probably think about it if I had a 2% deposit and it was difficult to save more. So it's something to take a look at. And if you're not sure with all of these different state and federal incentives out there, it's worth having a chat to a broker or an advisor, because sometimes it gets a bit confusing with all the various grants and schemes and incentives around the different states and territories. So it's always worth checking out what's out there. Let's have a look at this third story of the week. So macro business, Australia's apartment supply crunch continues to worsen. I guess all the same points that we've talked about, really. Construction costs are too high. Developer insolvencies have now hit 3,000 over the past year. Charter Keck Kramer said established unit prices will need to rise for developers to get interested in the market. Mortgage rates have also probably hurt developers and borrowers. And the general picture, when you look at it, high-rise approvals are down by about 75% from their highs in New South Wales, about 70% in Victoria, 60% in Queensland. Now, I think when you look at it across the market, that's been the big shift from the previous cycle to this one. Is the last cycle, we got a lot of high-rise towers being built, funded by non-resident investors, mainly from China, and that's just not happening this time around. So we're getting some more sort of boutique developments and townhouse developments here and there, and especially at the premium end of the market, but we're just not getting the same volume through. And I think probably a big part of that is just not just their prices don't work, but we just don't have the foreign investors to drive that and supply this time around.
Yeah, it's interesting. You put a graph on here, Pete, which I always love your blog, by the way, but the work in pipeline. It seems like there's still a lot in terms of a dollar value getting built. So maybe not, when you look at a dwelling number, it doesn't seem that much compared to long term. But when you look at a dollar value, we're actually, at all-time highs. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think the thing is, when you're looking at dollar values, a unit 5 years ago, well, it might cost 50% more now. So the same, so $1 million doesn't go as far as it used to, as they say. So I think, I think you need to look at the number of units for more of a like-for-like comparison. And you can sort of see, when you look at it, there's been some decent sort of a rebound in Melbourne, especially. And I think maybe that policy to sort of remove the stamp duty for Victoria, that could actually spark a bit of a construction boom in Melbourne and Victoria. But generally, if you compare to where things were a decade ago, we're just running so far behind. And we've been, I guess, caught flat-footed by the massive rebound in population. So, it's interesting. I talked to a lot of people around the country, and a lot of first-time buyers are now saying, well, maybe I will look at a unit. The price performance has been pretty reasonable over the past 4 years, and it's difficult to get into the market. But as long as you focus on a few sort of fundamentals, you want to avoid the stuff with very high strata fees, for example, or loads of facilities that you're never going to use and you have to pay for and things like that. But there's a real shortage. I mean, maybe those building approvals figures are starting to turn around, but it's a slow process when you're looking at medium density projects. I think if you look at house building, is on the way up in Perth. It's been pretty strong in Melbourne. Also, southeast Queensland starting to pick up, maybe even Adelaide a bit as well. But the units they can take 2 or 3 years really to start hitting the market. So it's probably going to be a shortage for quite some time to come by the looks of it.
Yeah, what's your take on the whole construction cycle, Pete? I mean, especially in the high, obviously you need some zoning changes, potentially. So maybe the developer needs to do some land banking, which, they might just need one site. They might need a group of sites, which could take many years to sort of acquire. You need to have the funding, or they need to have the capacity to build it if they're doing it themselves, right? They might have other projects that are, sometimes it takes many, many years, right, for them to actually get into, and they've got to get their designs and, get the feasibility to work and then lodge it and get council approval and then fight the objections. And, it's not as simple as sort of buy and build, is it? Right. And, and so I think that in numbers, whether it's, approvals or actual what's been approved but not commenced and what actually has been commenced versus completed, there's a lot to understand in terms of the pipeline for multi-res. Not greenfield estates a little bit, you can probably predict it a lot better, but I mean, the high density stuff's really hard to know, and it's a really long lag on what actually gets bought today versus getting built tomorrow. It's some time frame, right?
We don't really have speculative building in Australia. So developers don't just throw up a tower block and then just hope that the buyers will come. It's generally construction will not really get off the ground unless the apartments are largely pre-sold. So
that's right.
You do find that, that was different in Europe. If you went to Spain or Ireland in 2005, 2006, people were building the estates and then expecting the buyers to come thereafter. So it does tend to sort of level things out through the cycle. And that's why you get this kind of equilibrium of supply. You never sort of permanently oversupplied or undersupplied. It kind of comes back into balance. But I think there's more risks, I think, in the medium density sort of projects if you buy off the plan, because you can get a period where you appear to be undersupplied and then you get this massive surge of projects all hitting the market at the same time. There's a much bigger lag between you buying the property and it actually being constructed and finalized. So, it feels at the moment like we'll be in undersupply forever. But I dare say if we get towards the end of the decade, if we get a burst of approvals in the next 6 to 12 months and then developers start building as interest rates come down, if you project that forward another 2 or 3 years, well, then we will sort of potentially get a glut of new apartments and townhouses all hitting the market. But it feels like it's probably towards the end of this decade before that becomes likely.
Yeah, it's just I guess we'll do a bit of it on the ground though in Brisbane though, Pete. When you're looking around the traps at Noosa as well, are you finding that interstate migration is still there from a lot of your buyers and when you're going to auctions, or do you find that that's actually cooled off a little bit this year? Because we've definitely seen less people willing to move into state, but I was just curious whether you're seeing the same thing up there.
Well, I think we are still seeing, so for example, I went to an open home on the weekend and there was a couple of people there from Sydney. There's still plenty of that going on, but I think some of it is holiday homes. I think as well, what's maybe less well captured in the figures is the number of people who've gone back. I think there's a lot of people who are sort of what they call COVID refugees, and they could work from home for a couple of years. So people thought, well, why not go to the Gold Coast or why not go to the Sunshine Coast? But some of those that are now being told, well, you need to be in the office 3 days a week, and therefore they've gone back to Sydney and Melbourne. So yeah, I think on a net basis, interstate migration is probably cooled off for Queensland. There's still a lot of people coming up, as there always are, but it's not probably as intense as it was 12 or 24 months ago.
When do we know the next numbers on that? What sorts of figures you'd look at for that?
Yeah, so the ABS releases every quarter. They release figures called, they changed the name of the release. I think it's now just called population. And then there's the national, state and territory population figures. So at the moment, they only actually run officially until March 2024. So I think the next figures will be released in 9 days' time on the day of recording, 12th of December. So those figures will only go to June, though. So you don't really know in real time necessarily what's happening. And there's always a bit of a lag with these things because how do you know when somebody's relocated from, say, Sydney to Brisbane? Well, it's only when they register a driving license or something of that nature that you sort of get those figures starting to filter through. And that's why you do sometimes get revisions later on. The ABS tries to also do a real-time projection of what the population is on a thing called the population clock, which is just run through 27.5 million and is currently still growing at around 1 person per minute. But there's a fair bit of guesswork in that. And I think it's only when you get to the actual census that you get to find out what's really going on. And sometimes we've seen that population clock can be a few 100,000 wrong. If they made some of the estimates of sort of under or overshot.
Very good. All right, Pete, any final points for this week's 2 cents? Obviously it's a little bit dire on news stories coming into Christmas, but yeah, look out for our Christmas special in the next couple of weeks as well.
Yeah, so this week, by the time this goes, the national accounts will be out. We don't know what those figures will be, but if I had to guess, they're probably pretty modest. And yeah, we've had 6 quarters already of a per capita recession. So basically, the economy per person is not really going anywhere. And yeah, if I had to guess on the day of recording, it's probably a continuation of the same, really, fairly modest results, but we'll see. And by the time this goes out on Sunday, you'll know the results anyway. So yeah, that's about it for this week. As usual, if you want to have a chat to Chris about broking needs, number 1 broker, elite broker of the year 2024. And if you're interested in property strategy or buyer's agency stuff, just give us a buzz. There's always a link in the show notes, or you can track me down, petewargent.com. So any weekend plans, Chris?
No, just a couple of birthday parties and barbecues. Yeah, trying to enjoy the pool. So yeah, that's nothing much happening here, Pete. What about you?
No, pretty quiet for me. So not much going on here, just trying to finish a few deals. So yeah, have a great weekend, everyone, and see you next time.
See you next week, Pete. Thanks.
Thanks for watching this video on the Rask Network. While you're here, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can get videos each and every day on business, finance, investing, and so much more.